Prison is meant to be a place of punishment, but for some men, it becomes their empire. Throughout history, there have been inmates so ruthless, so feared, that even the most hardened criminals gave them a wide berth. These men didn't just survive behind bars. They thrived, ruling through fear, violence, and power. Some were gang leaders, some were lone wolves, but all of them made their mark as the most feared inmates to ever live. One of the most terrifying prisoners of all time was Charles Bronson, often dubbed Britain's most violent prisoner. Born Michael Peterson, he changed his name to match the famous action star, but his own reputation far exceeded any movie role. Bronson was notorious for taking hostages, inciting riots, and attacking guards, earning him decades in solitary confinement. His violent outbursts made him a nightmare for the prison system, as every attempt to rehabilitate him ended in chaos. Another inmate whose mere presence sent chills down spines was Thomas Silverstein, a former member of the Aryan Brotherhood. Silverstein was responsible for multiple murders behind bars, including the brutal killing of a corrections officer. His actions led to him being placed in solitary confinement for over 35 years, making him one of the longest-held solitary inmates in U.S. history. Even locked away, he remained a symbol of pure danger. Carl Panzram, a serial killer and self-proclaimed monster, openly admitted to killing over 20 people and sexually assaulting over 1,000 boys and men. His hatred for humanity was unmatched, and he took pleasure in every crime he committed. Even in prison, he continued his violence, assaulting guards and inmates alike. His last words before execution summed up his life. "Hurry it up, you Hoosier bastard. I could kill 10 men while you're fooling around." Robert Stroud, also known as the Birdman of Alcatraz, may sound like a gentle name, but his reputation was anything but. Stroud was a murderer who later became famous for his knowledge of birds, but his violent past made him one of the most feared inmates of his time. He killed a prison guard in 1916, an act that nearly got him executed. Though he spent decades studying birds, the prison system never forgot the level of danger he once posed. Donald Pee Wee Gaskins was another man who earned his place among the most feared inmates in history. A sadistic serial killer, Gaskins continued his killing spree even behind bars, managing to assassinate another death row inmate while already serving a life sentence. His ability to manipulate and kill even in a controlled environment made him a terrifying presence in the prison system. Then there was El Sayed Nosair, the first known Islamic extremist to commit a terrorist act on U.S. soil. He assassinated Jewish activist Meir Kahane in 1990 and was later connected to the first World Trade Center bombing while incarcerated. Even behind bars, he remained an influential figure, communicating with terrorist networks and spreading his ideology among radicalized inmates. Richard Kuklinski, better known as the Iceman, was a mafia hitman whose cold-blooded killings earned him his infamous nickname. He claimed to have murdered over 200 people, many of them through methods that left no trace. Even in prison, Kuklinski was regarded as one of the most dangerous men alive, feared by inmates and guards alike for his lack of remorse and his ability to kill without hesitation. Pedro Rodrigues Filho, a Brazilian serial killer, was one of the rare inmates who became feared not just by prisoners but by criminals outside the system. Known as Padrinho Matador or Killer Petey, he killed over 70 people, many of whom were criminals themselves. His reputation grew when he continued his killing spree in prison, murdering gang members and rapists, making even the most hardened inmates fear crossing his path. Then there was James Whitey Bulger, a notorious Boston mob boss who spent 16 years on the run before finally being captured. Even in prison, his reputation as a ruthless gangster made him a feared figure. However, karma caught up to him when he was brutally murdered by fellow inmates in 2018, a reminder that even the most feared can become victims behind bars. Frank Costello, another high-profile gangster, spent years behind bars yet managed to wield power from inside. Known as the Prime Minister of the Underworld, Costello was feared more for his influence than his violence. His ability to manipulate the prison system and maintain control over his criminal empire from his cell made him a legend among inmates. Another prisoner who ruled through fear was Roy DeMeo, a hitman for the Gambino crime family. DeMeo was responsible for hundreds of murders, many of which involved his gruesome Gemini method, where bodies were dismembered to eliminate evidence. Though he was never convicted of his crimes before his own murder, his reputation made him a figure of terror even among fellow criminals. Eugene Big Tuna O'Connor was another crime boss whose mere presence in prison created tension. A powerful figure in the Chicago outfit, O'Connor managed to keep his criminal operations running despite being locked up. His connections and ruthlessness made him someone no inmate dared to cross. Niels Hogel, a German nurse turned serial killer, was another prisoner who instilled fear, though his method of killing was less conventional. Hogel murdered over 85 people by injecting them with lethal doses of medication, making him one of the most prolific serial killers in modern history. Even in prison, his ability to manipulate and deceive kept inmates wary of him. The infamous BTK killer, Dennis Rader, is another inmate whose crimes still haunt those around him. Rader, who bound, tortured, and killed his victims over decades, showed no remorse for his actions. Though his notoriety made him a target in prison, his eerie calmness and lack of remorse continue to unnerve those who encounter him. Mikhail Popkov, a former Russian police officer turned serial killer, was known as the werewolf for his horrific crimes. He raped and murdered over 80 women, many of whom he lured into his car under the guise of offering them a ride. His cold and calculated nature made him feared even within the brutal Russian prison system. Issei Sagawa, a cannibalistic murderer from Japan, committed one of the most disturbing crimes of all time. He killed and ate a Dutch woman while studying in France but managed to avoid a life sentence due to legal loopholes. Though he was later released, his short stint in prison left other inmates horrified by his twisted mind. Jack Unterweger, an Austrian serial killer, was a rare case of a criminal who convinced the world he was reformed, only to continue his killing spree after being released. While incarcerated, he wrote literature that made people believe he had changed, but upon release, he resumed his murders. When caught again, he committed suicide rather than face justice. Even the most secure prison walls couldn't strip these men of their power. Some thrived in environments where survival depended on brutality, while others manipulated systems to their advantage. Regardless of their methods, they left behind chilling stories that still haunt correctional officers, inmates, and the outside world. One such case is Joaquin El Chapo Guzman, the infamous Mexican drug lord who led the Sinaloa cartel. Though he was arrested multiple times, his ability to bribe, threaten, and even escape made him a living legend among criminals. His most famous escape in 2015 involved a mile-long tunnel dug right beneath his shower. Even in maximum security, El Chapo was seen as a man capable of bending reality to his will. Pablo Escobar, one of the most notorious drug lords in history, took it a step further by building his own prison, La Catedral. This prison was more of a personal resort, complete with a casino, nightclub, and luxurious living quarters. Guards feared him not because of his physical presence, but because his reach extended far beyond prison walls. He dictated life and death with a simple command. In contrast to gang lords like Escobar, some of the most feared inmates were terrifying for their sheer unpredictability. Mark Chopper Reed, an Australian criminal, was infamous for cutting off his own ears and committing brutal acts of violence with no regard for consequences. Despite his crimes, he became a cult figure in Australia, openly joking about his past and gaining a following even among law-abiding citizens. Perhaps one of the most dangerous men to ever enter a prison was Albert Fish, the sadistic cannibal and child murderer. His crimes were so disturbing that even seasoned criminals wanted nothing to do with him. Known as the Gray Man, Fish sent letters to the families of his victims, describing in detail how he tortured and ate their children. When he was finally executed, the electric chair reportedly malfunctioned due to the large number of needles he had inserted into his own body over the years. Another feared inmate, Ed Kemper, stood at 6 feet 9 inches and had the intelligence to match his terrifying physical presence. Kemper was a serial killer who targeted women, including his own mother. His chilling calmness made him even more unsettling. Guards reported that he was polite and articulate, yet the knowledge of his crimes left them uneasy in his presence. And then there was Charles Manson, the cult leader whose influence was so strong that he didn't need to commit the murders himself. His followers did it for him. Even in prison, he remained a figure of dread, continuing to control and manipulate those who came into contact with him. His swastika tattooed on his forehead became a symbol of his twisted ideology. Rodney Alcala, known as the dating game killer, used his charm to lure in victims. A convicted rapist and serial killer, he even appeared on a televised dating show during his murder spree. His ability to blend in with normal society made him particularly terrifying. Someone who looked like an ordinary man but was a ruthless predator behind closed doors. Kenneth McDuff, a serial killer from Texas, was so feared that his initial death sentence was overturned, only for him to be released and continue his killing spree. His ability to exploit legal loopholes exposed major flaws in the justice system. When he was finally caught again, prosecutors ensured he would never escape justice.